so many different directions, Nico. I'm now going to turn to Lebo to hear from South Africa and to take soundings really from social research and listening closely to conditions and looking at the situation across many contexts. Lebo, I'm not doing great on the time, but over to you.
Okay, I'll try. Can you put up the presentation, Susan? While she's doing that, in this presentation, as Elaine has said, I'm using South Africa as a case study. So I'm using South Africa as a case study, just a brief crash course for the people who don't know a lot about South Africa. I know that many people know that we're just coming out of the apartheid system. The second thing to know is that South Africa is a very unequal society. For example, with 2% of the people who are really, really rich, with a big so-called middle class, and even bigger working or non-working lower classes. Many of these in the lower classes live in the rural areas, which is the focus of most of my work. So in my presentation, I would like to start by just stating my argument or my intended argument in this presentation. It is that poverty intersects in complex ways, as we have heard, with a variety of factors to negatively impact on education and educational outcomes. And for affected children, the impact of these factors, which vary from child to child, from community to community, and so on, often leads to poor performance in school and ultimately to school dropout. While policy makers and researchers have worked to identify these factors, and in particular those that impact directly on school failure and dropout, including but not limited to poverty, my presentation will suggest that these analyses are often limited. In my presentation, I will attempt to illustrate just how limited they are and what are often missing in the analysis. Using rural South Africa as a case study, as I said. To do this, I begin my illustration with the story that you see there, a digital story that was written and directed by a group of adolescent girls in rural KwaZulu-Natal, which is one of the 9 provinces in South Africa, who I've been working with for the past 6 years in a project that works on identifying issues related to gender-based violence against adolescent girls in the community. As you can see, I hope you have read the story, but the gist of it, we have done several analyses elsewhere, and if you are interested in those analyses, I'd be happy to forward the literature on it. But for the purposes of today, the gist of the story is that for girls who live in poverty, the options are often limited. And for these girls, they've often witnessed young girls and young women resorting to sex work as an option to lift themselves out of poverty. And in many of their narratives, often the girl gets sort of punished because they end up either HIV positive, or they are punished by society because, of course, in their view, sex work is negative. I'll let you read the story yourself if you haven't already done so. So I chose this story because in its simplicity, it illustrates the multiplicity of factors that impact on girls' life in this particular rural community. Importantly, it illustrates how these factors interact to impact on the lives of individual girls and group of girls, often with negative health and educational outcomes, among others. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. So the government of South Africa, through Statistics South Africa, usually measures child poverty using the multiple overlapping deprivation or MODA methodology. While it uses the child as the unit of analysis, it takes a life cycle approach to recognizing the different factors that impact on children's lives and the different needs of children in communities. And their argument is that they want to see the child as a holistic human being, not only impacted by one factor, but by a multiplicity of factors. In terms of research, a number of researchers have used the lens of multiple deprivation, which is also linked, which looks at a combination of factors or an intersection of factors that are prevalent in the environment and that impact on children's lives in those communities, and in particular that undermine their educational access and success. For us, looking at poverty this way, or looking at the lives of children in schools this way, has implication for an intersectional analysis. I won't go into detail with that because Nico has done a great job of introducing that concept. Next slide, please. Often, at least in the literature in South Africa, research that uses an intersectional approach uses these identity or different identity markers to illustrate how they intersect to impact either negatively or positively on individual lives. However, as I will try to show, there are more complex social factors that interact with these identity markers to positively or negatively impact on education in particular. Next slide. So just briefly, I'm not going to spend any time on that slide. It was just to discuss how intersectionality is often used, but I think I'll skip that, and just to stress that in the African context, because the concept was developed in the North, as researchers, we have often adopted the concept with some caution, but because it is, in our view, aligned with post-colonial notions of power relations, and that it departs from a unitary view of women, for example, to include other identities such as race, social class, sexual orientation, and so on and so on. So we adopt it with some level of caution. Thank you. In terms of poverty in South Africa, as I said, there's a large bulge at the bottom of the pyramid with a lot of poor people among the working class and the non-working class, the unemployed classes. Unemployment is currently, as I'm aware of, at about 35% of the population that is unemployed. And critics often say that that's an undercounting of the number of people who are unemployed in the country. So Stats SA suggests that 67% of South African children live in income poor families. And among these, 62% are multidimensionally poor. And Nick illustrated or defined for us how multidimensional poverty works. What's important for me in this presentation is that the highest deprivation rates are in education, in housing, and in health. I'm particularly interested in my work in education and in health outcomes among adolescent girls in particular. What I'm also interested in is that this multidimensional poverty among children is largely found in rural areas. And so in short, intersecting multiple deprivations have a negative impact, is what I'm arguing, on educational inequality and ultimately on school dropout. Next slide. And yet, as I said, explanations for school dropout or school failure or poor performance in school are often limited to two areas, with income poverty as the main reason why, for example, government will say schools are underperforming or children are underperforming in schools located in low-income communities. A second factor is, of course, the poor quality of teaching, particularly in those schools. And together, these two factors, or singly, lead to poor performance in school, poor school attendance, poor performance, and ultimately to high rates of dropout from school. Next slide, please. One factor that I'm interested in, because my work is around adolescent or with adolescent girls, is what's gender got to do with it? So a study by Quraish Abdul Karim and her colleagues in health found that the triple burden of poverty, violence, and HIV among girls impacts negatively on adolescent girls and young women in particular. So girls and young women, 15 to 24, particularly those in rural areas, have high levels of HIV infection. And in addition to that, they bear the most burden of poverty and intimate partner violence. For example, they are up to 6 times more likely to be HIV infected than their male peers. Among those who are HIV positive, they are more likely to experience intimate partner violence from their partners upon disclosing their HIV positive status. And this intersects with the fact that usually men do not test for HIV, and therefore their HIV status is often not known. And the woman is the first to know their HIV positive status. I could go on, but that's roughly how the intersections of poverty, violence, and HIV work in this instance. In our work, also with the girls in rural areas, we found that often in the context of poverty, communities have what I will roughly refer to as indigenous responses to poverty. And the nature of these is such that they are very gendered in the way they are conceptualized and gendered in the way they are applied. Two examples illustrate. I'm sure many of you know that South Africa has also the highest rates of gender-based violence in the world. And in the context of these communities, rather than relying on police intervention in cases of gender-based violence against girls, often communities will use local ways of resolving the issues. And these local ways or indigenous ways usually involve the perpetrator paying retribution to the family of the girl they have either raped or they have assaulted. And often, according to the girls, the negotiations and the reparations are not paid to her, but rather to the family. With one girl even saying that when that happened to her, she felt like nothing. That was her response when I asked her, so how did you feel when that was done? And she said, I felt like nothing. The second illustrative issue is often parents will marry off their daughters because of the practice of lobola, or I guess it's bride price, sorry, bride price that is paid to the family of the girl by the family of the man who's marrying them. So often in these contexts of poverty, parents will marry off their children in order to get the dowry, in order to get the bride price. And they often argue it as a protective logic, because they argue that they're protecting the child against and the family against poverty. They are also protecting the child, in their view, against having sex outside of marriage that might expose her to unwanted pregnancies and STIs. So it's a sort of a protective cultural logic that's used in the community. And so early and forced marriages are very prevalent, at least in these communities that I've been working in the past few years. And obviously, these together with poverty lead these children, the affected children, to drop out of school in order to be married. Next slide, please. Just an illustrative slide by Statistics South Africa to show how prevalent child marriages are in the country, with my province having over 25,000 in 2016 alone, children from 12 to 17 either cohabiting or actually married to men or boys. Okay, next slide, please. And as I've been trying to illustrate, all these often lead to high dropout rates among the affected girls. And indeed, the numbers in South Africa suggest that there are unacceptably high dropout rates in school. While there is high enrollments in grade 1, research by a group in Stellenbosch at Stellenbosch University has suggested that 50% of the children who enroll in grade 1 do not reach grade 12. And of those who reach grade 12, only 40% complete high school, and only 20% complete in such a way that they qualify to go to universities. So as I said, research has tried to identify reasons for these dropout rates, but also there's emerging research that has identified gender differences in the reasons for dropout. So among girls, pregnancy is often cited as the main reason for dropout, and other factors including forced and early marriages, gender-based violence, poverty, and so on and so on. While for boys is often individual choice, for example, lack of interest in school, or failing too many times. But for some of the boys, it is the need to go and find work because they are the only ones who can support the family. So my suggestion, or my my analysis is that if we adopt an intersectional analysis of school dropout, many more factors might emerge. For example, we could look at income and multidimensional poverty. We could look at unequal gender norms and gendered role expectations, poor access to health services, including sexual and reproductive health services and education for girls, but also poor quality of teaching or in schools. And these intersecting to lead to negative social and health outcomes, and ultimately to dropout. So what I'm suggesting is that we need a more nuanced intersectional analysis of the impacts of poverty and how it intersects with other factors to produce poor educational and health outcomes among rural girls. So for me, there are several implications for research. The first being that children impacted by multidimensional poverty experience negative consequences in their education. So theoretically, I've already suggested that an intersectional approach would be more appropriate to produce a more nuanced understanding of such intersections. And perhaps maybe even a post-colonial or a decolonial approach. I'm not talking about that today, for another day. The second point I've tried to make is, I haven't tried to make, but the second point is that available research currently is dominated by surveys, particularly people rely on analyzing Stats SA surveys. I'm arguing that we need more qualitative data to capture people's perspectives and experiences of the poverty they experience. Methodologically, intersectionality would require a bottom-up approach to such a research that would directly involve the perspectives of the communities we are talking about. So such methods as community-based research, narrative research, life history research, and others would perhaps address this this issue. And lastly, what kinds of questions do we need to ask? I forgot to tell you to move these slides. Yeah, and one more. Yeah. And lastly, a set of questions, I think, that would help to produce such an intersectional analysis and to map the issues in order to fully understand the impact of child poverty in the country are fourfold. So who are the children that are impacted by this? And what are the specific factors that make them vulnerable? The second factors would be to look deeper. Who are we missing? Who do we often miss when we look at the population of children? For example, what about trans children? What about gay children? What about rural girls? What about girls with disability? What about immigrant girls or refugee girls? And we could identify, in mapping these issues, we could identify groups that we often miss when we use the broad category of children in the schools. And the third question would be to analyze who are those with privilege and power, and how do these groups change? How do they stay the same, and so on? And lastly, what issues do we often leave out when we analyze the impact of poverty among children? I would like to stop there for now. You are muted, Elaine. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Thanks very much, Lebo. That's very, very rich, introducing some of these concepts of intersectionality, power, decoloniality, and complexity into the discussion. There has been a question that Ursula has raised, and she can't ask it herself, so she's asked me to raise it, and you could reflect on it or engage with it, or we can bring it forward to the plenary. But her question is, how does a child know their rights, and how can they exercise their rights to be able to express their views and grievances? Possibly something drawing on your fieldwork might illuminate that. And then anyone else would like to raise a hand, and just unmute yourself and chip in now while I quickly scroll through the questions. If anyone else has got it. Oh, Jenny has a question.
Hi everybody. Thanks for two really fantastic presentations. I guess when I was listening to Lebo, I was thinking I still had Nico's presentation in my head. So I think my question, I've probably got two questions in there for both of you, really. I really like the way you brought a kind of gender and intersectional dimension, Lebo, to the things that Nico was presenting to us. And while both of you were speaking, I was thinking of about the work we're currently doing as part of a longitudinal study in Uganda with young people, adolescent young people. And And a lot of the themes that Lebo talked about echoed in the talk of the young people that we've been working with. I think my question is, my first question is thinking about COVID and what this does to this relationship between work and school. Because you talked about sort of school dropout and work or school, but the situation we've had in Uganda, as in many countries, is that young people might be intending to go back to school, but they're out of school at the moment and they're working, and it's highly gendered, and they might be working to be able to get back to school. I just wonder whether what that does to the kind of analysis that you've been talking about, whether you've seen COVID making a difference. And then linked to that, I was thinking about young people who in Uganda have now been out of school for nearly a year, and some of them are starting to say they probably don't really intend to go back to school, but they do intend to get some sort of vocational education. And here I think my question is a bit more of a normative question, maybe. It's about the relevance of education, which I think Nico brought up, but also the kind of closing doors down if you, and of course, South Africa has a terrible history of that through the kind of limited streams of education that were for different groups under apartheid. But so at what point what's that, there's a tension between a kind of relevant education for work and an education that might give you opportunities to get a better job later on, the sort of short term and long term. So sorry, I think there's a few questions in there. Take up what you want.
Lebo, in addition to that one from Jenny, there's a comment from Gemma and Ursula about bottom-up research approaches being better able to get at multidimensionality. So again, some reflections on that. And that's probably enough on your plate for the slice of time you've got left.
Yes. I will start with the how children understand their rights, and from the perspective that often, at least in the South African context, children are seldom, certain children, particularly those in and I hate to use these words, in traditional communities, are not encouraged to voice opinions, particularly to adults. So it takes a lot of work and a lot of encouragement for them to do so. In our project, as I said, it's a 6-year project, and this is the last year of the project. And we have worked with these children from when they were in grade 8, and many of them have just now transitioned out of high school. My first meeting with them, they could hardly tell me what their names were. But by the end of last year, I couldn't stop them from talking. And part of us working together was building their confidence, building their self-esteem, building their skill in navigating the very conservative and traditional norms in the society, where children have to be respectful to adults. So how do you express your views respectfully, so to speak? And so building those kinds of negotiation skills among the children. Just a quick illustration. At the end of 2019, one of the girls we've been working with was abducted and forced into marriage. But she wasn't having it, and so she resisted. Unfortunately, members of the group went to the police, went to her mother, and together with the social worker, they rescued her and brought her back. And I would like to credit our project for one, helping her to recognize that she doesn't have to do what she doesn't want to do. So she understood that it is her right to refuse. And she had over the years developed the skills to do so. So what I'm saying is it takes a lot of work to develop that confidence among children who are not used and are not encouraged to speak out. The second question was relating to what has been the impact of COVID on schooling. As expected, when our schools went online, those of us who work in poor rural communities immediately said, well, that means no schooling then for children in rural communities because of lack of access to the internet, because of lack of access to technology. And indeed, that has been the case with rural schools. A few teachers have been creative in using WhatsApp and the phone to sort of teach or send work to children using WhatsApp and phones. A second impact relates to a dropout from school. I was just reading, and I meant to mention that when I was talking about the rates of dropout in school. A December 2020 Stats A report suggested that in 2020 alone, about more than 300,000 children dropped out of school, either because they couldn't access the online learning or because there were other issues that they were dealing with, for example, access to food, access to basic resources, and so on. I don't know whether I've addressed all of them.
I think, thank you very much, Lebo. And I think you've given us a great deal of scope and detail to think with. I'm going to slightly rejig the break. If we could take a 10-minute